Women in the United States first gained their right to vote through the 1930 Women's Enfranchisement Act. Since then, women have not only participated in the electoral process as mere voters, but have also gone on to break the glass ceiling in party leadership, local and state elections, and have even become Vice President of the United States. Should Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic nominee for the November 2024 U.S. presidential elections, win, the United States will also have its first female president, a milestone likely to spur women to run for the White House in the future, regardless of their affections for Harris. Despite the progress accrued over the years by champions of women's representation in all areas of society, major barriers still exist for young girls who seek to lead the country in politics. What are these barriers? How can women overcome them? How have other female leaders overcome them? You're listening to The Andrew Jose Show, your go-to podcast on all things culture, society, and entertainment. Today, I have the honor of speaking with Mary Chung Hayashi, a former California State Assembly member and award-winning author, about her latest book, Women in Politics, Breaking Down the Barriers to Achieve True Representation. In Women in Politics, Mary shares the journeys of 17 women in political leadership, including herself, who faced overwhelming odds but shattered glass ceilings to pave the way for future generations. Mary's work sheds light on the ongoing struggle for gender equality in politics and serves as a compelling call to action. Without further ado, let's head straight to the interview. Mary Chung Hayashi is an award-winning author, national healthcare leader, and former California State Assembly member. With a distinguished career in public service, she has spearheaded substantial reforms in mental health services, championed gender equality, and forged powerful, unprecedented partnerships for social causes that previously had no financial or public backing. Recognized as Legislator of the Year by the American Red Cross and the California Medical Association, Hayashi has also been featured on Redbook's Mothers and Shakers list and Ladies' Home Journal's Women to Watch. As principal of MKC Public Affairs LLC, she has successfully advised business and policy leaders on some of today's most complex public policy matters. She remains a steadfast proponent of social justice expansion and the rights of underrepresented communities. Mary Chung Hayashi, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Glad to be here.
What motivated you, Mary, to write Women in Politics, and why do you believe the lessons of these 17 women are worth telling for today's generation?
There are many reasons why, authors publish, a book like this, but, one of my main reasons for writing Women in Politics was to really inspire other women to create their own path, regardless of their background or ethnicity or family history. And, these women are role models, not because of the titles they have achieved, but because they forged ahead and defied the naysayers who told them that they couldn't achieve their goals or ambitions. And so often they, face incredible challenges, discrimination, barriers to leadership, but they never lost faith in their ability to make a difference. And that's why they're role models, because their stories show how far women have come in politics, but at the same time, how much further we still have to go.
But interesting point you also mentioned in the book is that the more women tend to see fellow women in politics, it's going to have a compounding effect in that it's going to encourage other women to run, and then other women seeing the other women running would continue to sign up for political office. What are the main barriers that women face socially, economically, and politically in running for office today? Is there a common pattern that you notice among all the trailblazing women whose stories you shared with us in Women in Politics? And what would these common barriers be?
So the book, obviously the book has like 50,000 words, about barriers. But to sort of summarize some of the key challenges that all women experience, in politics, I'll start focusing on maybe like 3 specific hurdles. One, what I call the ambition gap, 2, qualification gap, and the likability double standards are cultural barriers that are major obstacles for women. And I think addressing them obviously is key to encouraging more women to step up and succeed in leadership roles. So what are we talking about? So the gender gap in political ambition results from two factors. One, men are more likely than women to have been encouraged to run for office by another elected official or party leader. And second, when women and men have the same qualifications for public office, they evaluate themselves very differently. And I'll just give you one example. There's a study called Men Rule. And when asked, men were almost 60% more likely than women to evaluate themselves very qualified to run for office. On the other hand, women with the same or even stronger credentials were more than twice as likely to rate themselves as not qualified at all. And what's more interesting is that most men who said that they were not qualified would still consider running anyway. And I think, similar, you probably heard this, a similar thing happens in the corporate world, when men apply for positions that they meet just 60% of the required qualifications. But women only apply for the same position if they meet 100% of the required qualifications. And I think that women, for many women, I think, from young age, we are often, taught to diminish our skills and our achievements. And I think that boys are taught to value certain characteristics like assertiveness, confidence, and self-promotion. And these are traits very valuable to a career, in politics. And so, women candidates often have to prove that they're qualified. And for men, qualifications are often assumed. And studies showed that women tend to run because they're encouraged to do so. Whereas men, they tend to self-nominate because, they're supposed to be ambitious and they're supposed to seek a leadership position.
This likability gap, could you expound on that?
Sure. And of course, the, what I call the likability double standards, of course, relates to, the role of the press and the social media and sort of, one of the things that I point out is that, in order to increase representation, for women in politics, we also need to look at the makeup of, the representation of women in the media. And so, to explain kind of the likability double standard, media plays a significant role in, eliminating barriers for women in office. And how can they do that is that they tend to sort of focus on appearance and personality instead of, women policies and leadership. And so this kind of coverage can sort of reinforce that, harmful stereotypes and could undermine women's credibility. And so the studies have found that when the press talks about a woman's candidate's looks, for example, she becomes less likable. And it doesn't matter if the coverage is positive, negative, or neutral. But when the press talks about a man's appearance, which is very rare since there isn't much variation in style among male politicians, such coverage does not have the same impact on a man and it does on a woman. And so when, it's not just woman's appearance that gets much more attention, it should, our mannerism and behavioral traits, receive just as much, and justify scrutiny, if you will. And so one thing to remember about likability is that male candidates don't need to be liked to be elected. The voters will still vote for you, if they think that you're qualified. Whereas for women, voters are less likely to vote for a woman candidate. They do not like. And so not only do we have to prove that we're qualified to run, but we also have to be liked. And I think we saw a little bit of that during, Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump race, where, Hillary Clinton was often, viewed as not likable, very cold, distant, but definitely qualified. Whereas, Donald Trump was, had sort of that appeal and he was more likable, but didn't have the qualifications, but it still managed to win. And so that's what I mean by likability standard, double standard, is that women are not evaluated the same way that male candidates are.
The relationship between representation of women in traditional media and representation of women in politics. In your book, you, as you reiterated in your previous response, say that in order for us to increase representation for women in politics, we need to increase representation of women in media. Could you expound on the relationship between these two variables?
Right. And, this is very sort of the best way to describe my point is that in the corporate world, just as more women in corporate leadership lead to more gender, inclusive company policies, having more women in media decision-making positions can also shift how female politicians are portrayed. And so, and not only just the way we're portrayed, but also the type of sort of coverage, and the content, I think are also, influenced when you have more women. Excellent example, of how women in media can drive significant social changes. The work of New York Times reporters, Jodi Kantor and I think Megan Towie, who, broke the story about Harvey Weinstein's history of sexual misconduct. And their reporting, not only brought Weinstein to justice, but it also ignited this whole hashtag Me Too movement. And it's not that the Me Too sort of hashtag Me Too stories are new or they're necessarily newsworthy, but these two female journalists really took it on and, sort of help ignite or give, life to sort of that larger movement. And I think that reporting highlighted the power of media to influence public discourse and policy on gender issues. And so that's an example. And that's sort of what I'm talking about, is sort of by promoting more balanced and substantive coverage, about women's experience, gender politics, and gender equality. I think we can also help pave the way for greater, female representation in politics.
One of the things you criticize and identify as a major mental barrier for women running in politics is what you consider as the good girl mentality. What is this mentality, if I may ask, and how can women overcome it? Is all of this mentality necessarily a bad thing, or there is a way where women can leverage this good girl mentality to benefit them in politics?
Yeah, I I mean, just to talk a little bit about myself, I mean, I came to this country as an immigrant, didn't speak any English, grew up in a very traditional, Korean, family. And, from a very young age, like we were told to be good girls, which means that, you don't speak, you're supposed to be seen, but not heard. And so my good girl upbringing sort of set barriers around my own imagination of what women should be, so women should be polite, deferential, and avoid making waves. And don't speak, don't be assertive. And so I grew up with those values, and running for office was very difficult, obviously, because those things, those teachings, I think early sort of lessons really stay with you, even if you're like intellectually, over that, or if you think, even though you think that you have overcome those things, I think it's really hard. And, seeing someone like Kamala Harris break barriers and, rise to the highest levels of government, I think helps to shatter that imagination barrier that many women face. And so my own imagination barrier, and, political scientists, call this sort of, unconscious bias that everyone has, where we can't imagine seeing a different kind of person, doing certain jobs, like you can't be what you can't see. And if you don't see, a woman in governor position or presidential position, then people tend to envision a man, doing those jobs. And that's what this imagination barrier is. And, for me, seeing somebody like, even before Kamala Harris, there are many role models and many women who have broken, barriers. And seeing, women in leadership positions for me had a significant impact, because it showed me that you can be successful even though you're ambitious. Like Kamala Harris is not apologetic about being ambitious and strong, and and she can still make a significant impact. And so it's about redefining what it means to be a good girl, and realizing that ambition and leadership are not just acceptable, but necessary in order to be successful in politics. And so I talk a lot about being a good girl because, in my culture, that's something to be valued, not speaking up. And I had an older sister who passed away from, suicide. And, she could never talk about her problems or seek help for mental illness, because it's just, those are the types of things that we're not supposed to be talking about. And so she was a good girl who basically kept all of her problems to herself. And so I think that those, my good girl upbringing definitely had barriers. And that is not something that I'd like to sort of, to say that it could be applied in a positive way, just because it really, I think hinders, owning our own space and, sends the wrong message.
Women of color and women of ethnic minorities face racism and ethnic-based bias in addition to the gender-based bias that women as women face. What would you say are some unique barriers women with intersectional minority identities face in American societies compared to their white counterparts?
Well, I talk a lot about sort of, in the book, sort of my own experience as a legislator. There was only one other Asian woman who served with me, when we both got elected at the same time, and people would just constantly mix us up. They'll call me Fiona, and people call her Mary. And they just really haven't been around many Asian Americans. And so I talk a lot about that misidentification being a real problem for, women of color. But just more broadly, I think on just like institutional level, I think women of color significantly are more likely to be discouraged from, running for office. And, there's a study that I cite, that the Center for Women in Politics did that about 1/3 of all women who, run for office report that somebody tried to prevent them from running. But that number doubles for women of color. It's very high. And I think for women of color, stereotypes add another layer of challenge. And I could talk about Asian women, for example, were often stereotyped to being submissive and weak, which, conflicts with more of masculine style of leadership that society tends to value. And this stereotype can, lead to doubts about our strength as leaders, hurting our, viability as candidates. And the less viable we are or we seem, the less support we receive from donors and voters. And that creates a vicious cycle that I think further diminishes our chances of success. And so, during my first, campaign for state assembly, I received discouragement from the Alameda County Party chair who said that maybe I should, because I've never ran for anything, maybe I should run for, something local first. And my male opponent never ran for office either, but she would, she never asked that question. I asked her, are you asking the same thing? And she was very quiet and didn't say anything. And people just thought he was great and he was qualified, but I was automatically seen as not qualified because I didn't have that campaign experience. And so the perceptions of leadership and our capabilities seem different because I'm, because of my gender and race. And another question I got a lot was, what makes you think that you're strong enough to be a leader? I mean, that was another question that I was asked. And so, I think women are, often penalized for being ambitious and strong. And no matter what we do, it just feels like we begin at a significant disadvantage. But I think for women and women of color, I think we're just, because there's so few examples and because there's so few, women in elected position and leadership, sometimes it's just hard for people to see that we can be influential leaders, successful leaders. And so that's one of the key barriers I think that women of color experience that they have to overcome in politics.
When it comes to the question of increasing representation of women in politics, there's often the meritocracy versus representation question. Now, some argue that if we increase the representation of women for the sake of more representation of women, that could lead to the assumption that, quote unquote, women are diversity hires. How would you say we could balance the meritocracy but also representation? What guidelines would you recommend?
Yeah, this is a really good question and actually an important one, because, I think there's some, organizations that are really just focused on numbers, gender parity means a certain quota. And I think all of us know that that's not what this is about, or at least for me, promoting women in politics, is just a lot more complex than that. And so what I like to sort of focus on is, my interview with Celinda Lake. She's a Democratic pollster, who actually is doing vice president's campaign, as well. And, and she said outright, women don't always vote for women. And it's true. I can't vote for all women candidates. And, often we're, more, we align more with sort of what party we belong to. So people tend to vote along party lines. And so Republican women are going to vote for Republicans. even if they are feminist or they like women candidates, women aren't going to always vote for women. And that's perfectly okay. We need to emphasize that having more women in politics isn't just a liberal or conservative issue. It's about improving governance for everyone. And so, when we elect more women in government, we see diverse sort of public policy issues being addressed. The Families Leave Act, equal pay for equal work, reproductive rights. And so women tend to champion issues that are important for women and children. I mean, I know it's like sort of stereotyping it, but it's true. Like more female representation have led to more inclusive policies in those areas. And so when we have diverse perspectives, we have better public policies that benefit all communities. And that's not partisan or liberal or conservative issue. And one of the women that I talk about in my book is Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, a Republican rising star. I don't agree with her on anything on issues, but she took a bold step by standing up to her own party to start a political action committee aimed at recruiting more Republican women. And so I commend her for doing that, because diversity within the Republican Party is important, meaning we need to ensure that different perspectives are represented, not particularly like quotas, but diversity in terms of the issues and platforms that these women bring to the table. And so I think it's really important that you raise that question, because the book isn't really about like, let's vote for every single woman on the ballot, but let's not evaluate women based on what they're wearing, or how they laugh, or, what kind of color, shirt they're wearing. But let's focus on their policies and what they bring, what kind of skill sets and public policy issues to the table. And that's what the book is about.
About the issue of female representation in politics not being politicized as something that is exclusively liberal or conservative, what are some areas that you'd say advocates for female representation in politics can do better? Often conservative women, like their liberal counterparts, are attacked using gender stereotypes, intentionally or unintentionally, or stereotypes surrounding conservative women in general. And I'd say that in many ways has contributed to the imagination barrier for many conservative women, where when they see women in politics, their idea of women in politics immediately becomes being a woman affiliated with a Democrat or a progressive with different ideas about abortion, sexual orientation, and etc. How would you say we could do better to make the pursuit of female representation inclusive politically?
Yeah, so clarify this for me a little bit. So do you mean like women, when women candidates are attacking other women? Is that what you mean? So clarify that for me. When you say like liberal counterparts are, conservative women
Yes.
are attacked, you mean by women versus women, or you're just talking about more broadly, like their gender stereotypes?
So it's women versus women in some cases, and also media in general, where a conservative woman who is championing causes that are not traditionally associated with what we'd consider to be feminist or liberal.
Yeah, I think that at least from my book, I don't really get into like political agendas or any issues that are polarizing, because this is really about identifying barriers and challenges that women face when they run for office, and sort of like what needs to be done. But I think one thing that media can sort of play a significant role in raising, barriers for women in office, is to make sure that the coverage doesn't reinforce harmful stereotypes and undermine women's credibility, because it's like they don't really need to take that further, and women, it's not just women's appearance that, gets much more attention. And I don't know if you follow like Kamala Harris's campaign, but it's a lot of conversations about, how she laughs, and it's like, well, why is that? What is that relevant to you? Why are we even talking about that? And the press sort of bringing that attention and to have a national conversation about what she's wearing or how she laughs isn't really relevant to her candidacy. And so I think one thing to remember is that like everybody has a role to play, in terms of breaking down those barriers and breaking down those stereotypes. And it has nothing to do with sort of issues per se about, it's just that more women in leadership roles lead to more gender inclusive policies, and studies have shown that. And so how do we lift up those women, and how do we hold these sort of social media and the media, traditional press more accountable when they drive certain kind of coverage? One thing that I point out in my book is when Joe Biden, won, and this first, State of the Union address, where Kamala Harris was sitting behind him, and I guess she was wearing a brown suit. I didn't even notice. And the next day, everybody talked about the color of her suit and how she, we need a fashion police, and her brown suit looked like a UPS uniform. And it's like, and so whatever Joe Biden was trying to communicate with the country couldn't get through. Like his message never gets through because we're so obsessed talking about what she looks like. And so I think those are the types of things that we really need to stop and start calling out. And we need to sort of discourage, media from doing that. And so that's sort of the best answer I can give, because the book really isn't about liberal versus conservative women, or, how they're valued for their leadership or ideas. We just want women to be judged on substantive issues and their governance style, and not like what they dress or laugh or how we present ourselves.
You mentioned in your book, male allies are important in the process of increasing female representation in politics. Could you expound on the role male allies play in increasing female representation in politics, and why do you argue that they are indispensable in breaking the gender gap?
Yes, thank you for that. And one of the chapters that I've sort of dedicated to mentorship and allyship is really about the role of men. When I interviewed these women, who ran for office, many of them benefited or mentored. They were mentored by men, including myself. And so I felt the need to really, highlight that and sort of, profile. I interviewed my mentor, then Assemblywoman Daryl Steinberg, a man. So it's 17 women, that I interviewed for the book, and a man, because they have a very important role to play, in breaking the gender gap, and male allies, when men talk about women's equality and, when they advocate for women's rights, they're often serve as more effective messengers to other men. And so instead of me talking to men, studies have shown that if men talk to other men about women's rights, that really helps to shift perceptions and break down the barriers. And, and the studies back this up, and that showing that male support is critical in helping, women succeed. And one example that I love to talk about is Kamala Harris's husband, because he looks so happy and he really loves that role, being a second gentleman. And, just like the way I talked about, women can't be what they can't see, and they have that imagination barrier, and we need more women in office. It's same for the men as well. Men can't be what they can't see. And so when they see somebody like, Doug Emhoff, playing that sort of supportive role, that really is a role model. He's really serving as a role model for other men and showing that the importance of, standing by their women as they break new ground. And, this kind of male allyship, I think, is essential for creating, more inclusive and representative government. And, my own experience, my mentor who championed mental health issues in the legislature, he's the one who inspired me to run. And so even though he's not a woman, he's someone who I really wanted to be like. I wanted to be like Daryl, and so when it comes to, like role modeling and having a mentor, it's not always about sort of this lean in message, women have to help other women, but it's also men who are in powerful positions. They can play a key role in, women's careers. And so I really felt the need to include men in this conversation. And so many men have influenced all of these women in the book, who are successful leaders in politics.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just listened to Mary Hayashi, author of the book Women in Politics, Breaking Down the Barriers to Achieve True Representation. Mary Hayashi, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Andrew Jose Show. If you have not already done so, please subscribe to us on Substack at andrewjoseshow.substack.com. We are also on Twitter and Instagram at Andrew Jose Show. Also, make sure to follow us on whatever podcast streaming platform you're using to listen to this podcast to not miss out on any new updates from this program. Thank you so much, and this is your host, Andrew Jose, signing off.